195 days ago, I bought PICO-8, a fantasy console that has all the tools that you need to create a retro 128 by 128 game. Now for some reason I bought this and never used it, but today that changes because I'm going to be bidding off my regular game engine Godot and making a game using PICO-8. Oh, and I'm leaving to go on holiday in less than 48 hours, so I have to complete the project before I leave. Just like every other game, let's start with an idea. I want to keep things super simple because I've never used PICO-8 or Lua before, and also because I have less than 48 hours. The idea I have right now is to steal the Chrome Dinosaur game and add a bit of a twist to it. I'm thinking that every 30 seconds or so an event could happen that would make the game a bit more interesting and a bit more difficult. For example, the player's controls could be switched around or the game speed could be increased. Like I said before, I've never used PICO-8, but so that I'm not going in completely blind, I have done a little bit of research. I think the first thing that needs to be done is the player. So I'm going to start by drawing it inside of PICO-8's sprite editor. The sprite editor itself is pretty easy to use, but it does have some limitations, such as limited number of sprites, a limited area to draw the sprites in, and a colour palette that's limited to only 16 colours, which isn't a lot. Anyways, I spent some time trying to draw a dinosaur, but it didn't work out too well, so I ended up just drawing a cowboy instead. I then gave it the ability to jump. The way I did this at first was by directly changing the player's Y value. But this looked too sudden, so I made it so the player's Y value is increased over time and then reduced over time for the fall. The code for all this is a little janky, but it works. The player looked a little small on the screen though, so I redrew it at a bigger scale that covers 4 sprite tiles. I guess normally this would be a pretty bad thing to do, but this game isn't going to have too many sprites, so it didn't really matter too much. Next, I added the background using PICO-8's map editor. The map editor allows you to draw a map using the sprites you created in the sprite editor. To get it to appear in the game, you just call the map function instead of the draw function, and there it is. It doesn't look very pretty, but that's kind of a theme with all of my games at this point. Now it's time to add some enemies, or in this case, obstacles. The idea is pretty simple. The obstacles spawn off screen to the right and then move onto the screen. But how do you spawn objects in PICO-8? Well, apparently by using tables. You see, we can create a table and store some values such as an X and Y coordinate inside of that table. We can then take that table and put it inside of another table, and that's like object instancing or something. To make the objects move, we can set up a for loop that goes through and moves each one to the left every frame. We can then do the same thing to draw the enemies to our screen. Now we have a working way to spawn objects, we need a way to detect collisions between them and the player. Normally you would do this by using some type of collision shape, but PICO-8 doesn't have any, so we need to create our own collision system. The problem was I literally had no idea how to do that, but luckily I found this Reddit post where someone had posted some code, so I did the programmer's special move and yoinked it right into my script, and surprisingly it worked. I don't fully understand how this works, but I'm pretty sure I have a brief understanding, so here's my 10-second code explanation. So the collision function requires 2 object inputs. It then uses the X, Y and a third value called size to essentially create 2 collision zones, one for each object. It then compares those zones to each other to check if any of the values overlap. If they do overlap, it returns true, and if they don't overlap, it returns false, and done. Now that we can detect collisions, I made it so if the player touches an obstacle, they lose the game. For the score system, I added a zone below the player that if any of the obstacles touch, it adds 1 point to the score. Next up, let's add the events, because right now we just have a clone of the Chrome Dinosaur game and I don't feel like getting sued. I'm going to add a total of 3 events to the game because honestly I'm running out of time and I can't think of any more ideas. The first event is the speed event. This was pretty easy to implement, but it did have the unintended consequence of making the time gap between objects longer. I mean, it made sense, but it also meant I had to make some changes to the spawning system to speed up the spawn rates while the event was active. After some trial and error, I got it working pretty well, and this is what it looks like. The second event I wanted to add was the direction switch event. This would change the direction that the obstacles would spawn in. To do this, I just changed the spawn position and inverted the speed so that the obstacles move in the opposite direction. This surprisingly just worked the first time, so I moved on to creating a third event, which is the input change event. This event would choose a random input from a predefined table and set that as the jump key for a small amount of time. This was really annoying to test because I didn't know which key to press. I also then realised that this will be an annoying game mechanic, so I added some text which tells you which key is the current jump key. Thinking about it now, this event is way too easy to deal with, and I should have made it so each time the player jumps, the key changes, but oh well. With all the events created, I made a new system to randomly select one of them every X amount of seconds. I added some randomness to how often an event is selected to make them less predictable. To help test if this system works, I added some text which displays when an event is happening, and I actually kinda liked it, so I decided to leave it in the game. The game was pretty much done at this point, apart from the fact that I completely overlooked sound. So I made a couple of sound effects using PICO-8's sound editor and added them into the game. Here's what they sound like. It's really convenient to have all the tools that you need to make a game in one single program, even if those tools do have some limitations. I've had a lot of fun using PICO-8 and will definitely be using it in the future. For now though, the game is available on my itch page, and if you've enjoyed this devlog, consider checking out one of my other ones that's on screen now. Oh, and subscribe. I also have a Patreon in the description if you'd like to support me by throwing a couple bucks my way.